Okay, afternoon everyone. I'm going to be covering three different things today from The Great Gatsby. We all know that obviously landscapes and place are the focus, but I just wanted to remind you of something, that in the narrative, geographical setting can serve different functions. One, it can be literal, as we see with Valley of the Ashes, okay? But it can also be a fictional place. So let's not forget that, say, something like the whole idea of the Wild West in the United States is largely fictional. And that will be one of the things that I cover today. It's often overlooked as the importance of frontierness, okay, in Gatsby, okay? But it can also be a completely invented world as well. And a final thing that perhaps I should have put there is we mustn't forget that they are interpreting the idea of place in a highly metaphorical sense, so it might be things like the past, memory, even things like gender or crime can be associated with place. So you need to have a very expansive idea of what place is. Here are 4 titles taken off exam papers: The Significance of Gatsby's House and Garden. I just wanted to remind you, if you get a question like that, you need to force an argument in the introduction, don't you? You need to say, one way of reading this is this, one way of reading it is this. Remember that all essays, regardless of whether they're asking you a question or not, need a counter thesis, don't they? And that debate will push the narrative forward. Otherwise, your AO3 mark will be low. Here we've got conflict in The Great Gatsby emerges as a clash of cultures rather than a clash of individuals. I think you've done that one. The significance of the East and West egg, that's so easy. You'd have to hug yourself if you got that in an exam. And finally, look at the way that money is presented as the main focus. Let's take that one very quickly now. If you just described money and materialism, you could possibly get yourself up to a grade B. I would say you'd need a counter thesis. So it'd be a good idea to put, say, romance against money. And say, well, an element of Gatsby is about materialism, but there's also a kind of romantic counter-thesis that's going on. Quickly, Ruby? Without doubt. You could do, and you could say that, money is not homogeneous. We know that you get non-olfactory money, and then you get the kind of new money that stinks. I'm going to be arguing in today's session that all the money is shown to stink in the end, okay? Now, all essays on Gatsby are about Nick. Never forget that. Doesn't matter what you're asked, okay? Nick is our point of view, isn't he? Everything we see is through Nick's eyes. I was saying to Monroe earlier, there are moments when Nick changes his focalization, and I'll speak to that in a moment, but don't forget that everything is seen through Nick's eyes. If you took the events of the novel, the actual story, it isn't such a dramatic story. It's Nick who infuses it with meaning. So many of you, for instance, when I've spoken to you about Jordan, take Nick's view far too literally. I would urge you to look at one of the essays that I'm going to provide you that looks at Jordan from a far more sympathetic point of view. It's a deeply misogynistic novel, and Nick's lens is deeply misogynistic. His version of Jordan could be disputed in many ways, okay? So as the narrator, it is Nick that turns Gatsby into the Great Gatsby. It is Nick who provides the epic dimension, just like Williams takes a story in New Orleans and infuses it with epicness and tragedy. And I hope you wrote about that when you did the essay title for me recently. Nick obviously elevates Gatsby from being a gangster, a charlatan, into a kind of American tragic hero. And Nick, of course, doesn't give us a linear narrative. He completely fragments the whole narrative, doesn't he? And in fact, he withholds a great deal in terms of the narrative. Monroe was asking me a moment ago about AO2 form and structure. Well, that's something you'd want to write about, isn't it? We are not told things until much later. A great deal of it, Monroe, is about withholding information to create narrative enigma. Before we know Gatsby's story, we're told that he may have killed a man. He may be related to the Kaiser. We have this kind of enigma that gets generated. Only much later slowly does Nick fill in the details for us. It's one of the things that makes it such a sophisticated modernist novel that breaks with the Victorian model of realism and linear causal networks, which is what they do in a Jane Austen novel, isn't it, for instance, you know? Not that Jane Austen is Victorian, she's Regency. Nevertheless, that model of one thing follows the other. Well, Gatsby completely breaks that, and he does so because he uses Nick as his vehicle. Now, the frontier is what I'm going to be talking about mainly today, okay? And I think it's a much neglected part of the novel. It's a big place in the novel, and it actually figures in the imagination of the characters a great deal. Why is the frontier important? Well, it's very important to the American psyche in general, isn't it? The frontier is about energy. It's about American enterprise, isn't it? At its worst, it's about land grabbing, theft, killing, gold mining, guns, cowboys, genocide of Native Americans, etc. Now, this doesn't all feature completely in Gatsby, but it's definitely there. There's also a kind of a sense of the discomfort of the growth of corporate America. Sometimes people call Fitzgerald a socialist. I don't believe that at all. I think Fitzgerald is an ardent conservative, in the true sense of conservatives. I think he looks at the modern America with a sense of disdain and prefers the kind of idea of traditional wealth. You mustn't forget that he hails from the Deep South himself, and his father is a kind of pseudo-aristocrat in much the same way that Nick is. Do you remember how Nick begins the novel claiming that he's from, is it the Dukes of Buccleuch? Is that how you say it, Monroe? Buccleuch. There we are, that he's from the Dukes of Buccleuch. In actual fact, his real lineage is that his grandfather owned a hardware store. And please watch the Massalet videos. There's an excellent one on Nick. One of the things that I've missed before is that Nick's grandfather hired a second who went to the war for him. Now, you could do this if you had money. And the lady, whose name eludes me, who narrates that video, points out that Nick also acts as a kind of observer quite often, rather than a participant. One of the things about Nick is that he's a voyeur, isn't he? And we see that from the beginning. That he listens to other men's stories, doesn't he? He's not so much an actor, he's an observer, isn't he? Now, going back to the frontier, here's a picture of Dan Cody, the sort of drunken adventurer who puts, Gatsby on his way. I'm going to be arguing he's a kind of precursor to Gatsby, and he's also a kind of surrogate father, isn't he? And he's associated with the spirit of audacious enterprise, with what Fitzgerald calls the saloon and the brothel, the wild side of America that is so different from the East Coast, which is so desperately trying to model itself on Britain and Europe. Now, on your sheets, I'm going to begin with this fabulous little epigraph that is often neglected, but is key to the story. Then wear the gold hat. Well, we know the gold hat is about social mobility. It's about audaciousness. So we immediately have the link, don't we, between Gatsby and Daisy. But Thomas Part de Villiers is actually the sobriquet for Fitzgerald. And by this stage, Fitzgerald, a sobriquet is when you take on a name, okay? And it's what is nom de plume, they call it, your writing name, okay? Now, by this stage, Fitzgerald is married to Zelda, but it's important that you know this, like Zelda's his wife. She's the it girl of the United States. They're an it couple, like the Kardashians today. 1 minute, Rubes. And what's so important about that is that Zelda's family said, go to hell, when Fitzgerald first started courting her. They looked down on him and sneered at him. Fitzgerald was one of what we could call the sort of genteel poor, the shabby middle class, who were on the sort of outskirts of wealth. He was a bit like a Jane Austen character where you get adopted by a wealthy aunt, but get reminded every day that you're a charity case. So he was enamored by wealth, but wasn't really in wealth. Now, if you think about it, Fitzgerald has definitely written some of himself into Gatsby, has he not? Yeah? So I think it's absolutely key to begin with that. What do we know about Gatsby in the novel? We know that later that he hails from absolute poverty. We find this out right at the end of the novel from his father. His life has been a desperate attempt to hide his poor origins. And yet today, we would see him as a hero, wouldn't we? We'd see him as an American king of enterprise and self-betterment, a kind of Benjamin Franklin figure. But instead of that, he invents stories about himself that make him in many ways reduced, that he's a lazy, good-for-nothing rich boy. He says he lived like a young Raja and achieved nothing. In actual fact, we know that he's a man of incredible energy, isn't he? Audacity, like the frontier, okay? Now, why am I stressing on the frontier so much? Well, the frontier is where Gatsby makes himself. The frontier is where Jim Gatz becomes Gatsby, where he's able to remake himself. Why is it set in Lake Superior? Why is this small little section so important in my eyes? Mr. Brett and I were speaking a minute ago. Lake Superior is 3 times the size of Wales, Sarah. England is only 1.5 times bigger than Lake Superior. It is like a gigantic inner ocean in the United States. It reminds us of the vastness of America. And that geographical vastness is really important. Because unlike Britain, you can't really remake yourself in the United Kingdom in the way that you could in America. This vast and, empty landscape allows such possibility. And Gatsby uses the geography of America to make a new version of himself. Do you remember how he's born of a god and everything? He is a self-creator, and this is an American element of the American psyche, I think Fitzgerald's showing us. Europe does not have this level of space, both physically and class-wise and social-wise, okay? Dan Cody, who I've said is his kind of surrogate father, is a made-up name combining, so it's a sort of pseudonym combining 2 people, Daniel Boone and Buffalo Bill. And these are both adventurers, but they're also, in Buffalo Bill's case, he actually does like big Wild West shows as well. So in a way, Dan Cody is a fiction too, like a kind of piece of theater, okay? Now, Dan Cody's boat is called the Tuolumne. I think I've said that right. This is the name of his boat, and this is very important. This was the richest gold field in California, okay? Interestingly, though, guys, Dan Cody misspells it. I think that's very significant, okay? It shows that his wealth comes from these gold mines. Don't forget, you used to like grab land, shoot people, kill, you know what I mean? Which is why it's really important that Dan Cody's money is made in this way. We don't know where Tom Buchanan's money comes from, but what Tom has been able to do is to clean his money, isn't it? Dan Cody's money, like Gatsby's money, though, is new stinking money, isn't it? And I think it's really important that he descends into kind of alcoholism. And again, this is a misogynistic novel, and behind most of the downfalls of men is a feckless woman. I won't comment on that. Why does Fitzgerald introduce Cody at this point in the novel? Well, it's really interesting. I want you to remember one of the key things about the way that Cody's introduced is that they, after seeing this elaborate Hotel de Ville with all this tacky excess and meretricious stuff, what happens? They find Gatsby's bedroom, and it is completely plain and Spartan. Almost like we found the real J. Gatz. When we look earlier into his life, we see like he was a self-disciplined guy, wasn't he? A guy who even tries to stop chewing gum and stuff. So by nature, he is the other side of the American dream, the Benjamin Franklin idea, get up early, improve yourself. The wealth is all for Daisy. And the wealth doesn't really sit well with him. But in this room he has this photo of Dan Cody. Why would that be? Clearly Dan Cody meant something to him. So Dan Cody is his vehicle into this other world. He arrives absolutely poverty-stricken, doesn't he? He has nothing. He has some kind of jersey on, doesn't he? And by an act of fluke, he's able to save Dan Cody's life, showing him about the storm that's coming. And what happens is this extraordinary kind of transformation as a result of this. Daisy looks at the photo and she says, I adore it. The pompadour. You never told me you had a pompadour, or a yacht. Of course it wasn't Gatsby's yacht, was it? But look how Daisy reads it. So what does Dan Cody do? He allows this transformation. He allows J. Gatz to turn himself and to produce a new narrative where he's a wealthy, successful, extraordinary man. Another thing that will be very important, I don't have time to talk about today, is don't forget about the war. War allows remarkable social mobility and transformations, doesn't it? Including that path to being an officer, including that short stay at Oxford. Do you remember this? And the way that he's able to transform himself for Daisy into a kind of officer. So how and why does Fitzgerald juxtapose Gatsby's meager origins with his self-perception? Okay. Well, I'm going to pick out a couple of phrases here that I think are really important that you need to learn, okay? When he saw Dan Cody drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior, the word insidious means invisibly dangerous, okay? It's a kind of metaphor for what's happening to Dan Cody. Dan Cody's been this incredible adventurer, but his wife has sent him away. And here he is. And where is he sailing to, guys? Is he on the high seas? He's on a lake, and even though it's a big lake, he's sailing round and round. He's trapped, isn't he? Inland. He's not an adventurer or a sailor. He's actually a kind of prisoner by now. I think that's very, very significant, okay? And here we hear J. Gatsby. And here's a wonderful example, Monroe, of Nick's perspective focalizing as the young Gatsby. Whose words are these? He was the son of a god. A phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. Now, that's an extraordinary thing. Why would he be a son of a god? Because like a Messiah, he sees himself as this kind of extraordinary figure. This is all fantasy, isn't it? But what's so important about this is that it's a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. Could that be a description of America? That the United States that we're going to see later when I speak, the fresh green breast, this virgin land that offered such extraordinary potential to people, is now a kind of corrupted place. And I think that that's very, very important indeed. Okay. My next question is, why does Nick imagine Gatsby would have this attitude to women? Okay, because I think this is going to be really important. So we know from a young age, Gatsby is incredibly handsome. And he is the ideal America frontier man, isn't he? Listen to the description. Brown, hardening body. He's not some kind of decadent, weak, East Egg dwelling, pathetic guy who lives in luxury and stuff. He represents all that is admirable in America, isn't he? The frontier man, etc. And part of being a frontier man is he doesn't mess around with all this, chivalric love stuff. He's regularly sleeping with women. He knows their bodies, and it hardens him. And he becomes completely contemptuous to them, doesn't he? The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him at night. So his imagination is incredibly powerful. And I think this ability to seduce women and to sleep with women with such ease is part of his, gives him this kind of, it's almost like they're muse for him, isn't it? And it makes him feel powerful, etc. But at the same time, it fills him with contempt. He's almost got the Dan Cody attitude towards women. If you want a woman, you go to a brothel, hasn't he? Now, why is this significant? Well, think about Gatsby meeting Daisy. What does she do? She completely renews his perception of woman, doesn't she? She brings magic back into woman, doesn't she? And she is like the girl, we're told at one stage, who's up in the tower, who's unattainable. So these other women that he stripped and used, how different to have a girl who is unattainable. So think of the juxtaposition of that and how this helps to stimulate his imagination. Now, one of my favorite writers, and Mr. Burke's favorite writer, is Ernest Hemingway. What does he say? He says, all American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. Okay, big claim. Huckleberry Finn, I think you could see a little bit of Gatsby in Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn is a guy who lives with his adopted aunt, and he doesn't want to go to school. He skives off school. He goes fishing. He does bad things. He climbs trees. He's like a kind of all-American boy who embraces nature and hates the sort of civilized, stifled world, just like Gatsby. Gatsby's education is in the wild, isn't it? It's in the frontier. This is the American dream of like Walden, of Thoreau and Emerson, and this whole idea that an education is better in the wild than in books. And this is what Gatsby does, doesn't he? He brings himself up in the wild. He's also what we call a picaresque figure, which is a word from Spanish fiction, and it's all about a lowly character who, through his clever wits and talent, is able to pick his way to the top in a really clever way. So Gatsby is a very picaresque character, just like in some ways Huckleberry Finn is as well. He's a bit of a wheeler-dealer kind of character who his education, like I say, doesn't come from books, it comes from the streets, etc. Okay? Now, if you don't understand anything, I'll stop in a minute and you can ask me, yeah? So now this relationship that I want to look at here, to what extent, in what ways does the relationship between Gatsby and Cody mirror that of Gatsby and Wolfsheim? Because Gatsby has two surrogate fathers, doesn't he? Wolfsheim is also a surrogate father, and of course he performs a similar role. Remember that Gatsby's starving after the war. He's an officer, but he has no way of supporting himself. Do you remember? And then he meets Wolfsheim. And what does Wolfsheim see in him? He sees a beautiful blonde white boy with a military history who can be his front of house. Wolfsheim is living in America in a very anti-Semitic time, okay? A lot of Jew-hating going on in the United States, etc. What's Gatsby going to be? He's going to be his WASP front man with an Oxford education and a glittering military record, isn't it? So in both cases we see, guys, the parallel is that Gatsby is elevated by these father figures, okay? Now, Dan Cody, on the other hand, is completely reduced by his marriage to Ella Kay. Significantly, she is a newspaper woman. She represents the modern paparazzi kind of America, doesn't she? One of the things that happens in the novel over and over again is we see the paparazzi. They come at the end to Gatsby's house. We see advertising everywhere, don't we? We see Dr. TJ is everywhere, isn't he? The eyes. There's advertising, commercialism everywhere. And I think Ella Kay is a kind of femme fatale and another destroyer of men. It is Ella Kay who, after marrying Dan Cody, sends him out and exiles him on the ship, and where he takes to alcohol. And without his kind of mission in life, he is reduced. He's impotent. Let's not forget this book is full of impotent men like Wilson, like Nick, and like Dan Cody. And so Ella Kay, in line with Nick's kind of misogynistic narrative, is another female villain. Isn't that true, girls? A reducer of men, a destroyer of men. And Dan Cody then slips into alcoholism. Well, why is that important? Well, I'm going to argue because just like with Wilson, as we'll see in a moment, Oh, here's the quote that I wanted to, before I move on to Wilson. This is the one you need to know. During one phase of American life, brought back to the eastern seaboard the savage violence of the frontier brothel and saloon. So this history of America is being forgotten in the East Eggs in particular, isn't it? With all these kind of, top gentrified people who turn their garages into stables, reversing history, making a kind of medieval castle of your house, etc. Well, Dan Cody represents that other, really violent America that has been forgotten. Now, why is this so significant? Why did I bring in Wilson? Wilson is dying, and the Valley of the Ashes shows that the modern America has none of the fertility, does it, of the old America, of the fresh green breast. That's all been contaminated, hasn't it? And Wilson is living and he's dying in this kind of perverted farm. You remember the Valley of the Ashes is described as? A fantastical farm. And what does it grow? It doesn't grow plants, it grows ash, doesn't it? So Wilson is contaminated and being killed by this, isn't he? I'll talk in a moment about Wilson the Fisher King. And what does Wilson say when he's absolutely desperate? How will he cure himself? He will go west. I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west. By this stage, that statement is pathetic. And I mean that in the old sense of the word. It's filled with pathos. The West, they've run out of land, haven't they? The gold is gone. This frontier thing is gone. And America's becoming a settled place, isn't it? Sadly, Wilson has missed the boat. So the Fisher King, the sick Fisher King, will not be replenished and renewed by going west. He will die. Very important. I just took a little photo of this from, do you remember Gatsby's diary? So important to see that he had this diary, that he, rose at 6, that he didn't want to chew gum, that he didn't want to hang around the cafes wasting time, that he tried to account for every moment of his life. Now, this is Protestant America. Benjamin Franklin told young men, keep a diary, be productive, look at your time. Now, this is why it's so important not to confuse Gatsby with Trimalchio. Now, that was going to be the original title of the novel. Trimalchio is a character from Roman drama who would have giant parties and would drink himself stupid and loved luxury. He was a slave who became wealthy. Monroe? Absolutely, another one. And Under the Red, White and Blue, there's so many different primary colors. He went through so many different titles before he went for The Great Gatsby. But this literature of self-improvement shows you that actually Gatsby is incredibly disciplined. Like the bedroom, does he drink? No. He looks at Dan Cody and he never drinks, does he? But of course, he has his Achilles heel, not eel. And that, of course, is going to be Daisy. And above all things, Nick rewrites Gatsby's story so that it becomes not the tragedy of a man who falls in love with a girl from a higher class. It becomes the tragedy of the country, doesn't it? Of the corruption of this potential, of this energy and early idealism. And this is perhaps the most beautiful part of the novel to me, this yearning for purity. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses begin to melt. Remember, Nick told us, you can't go back in the past. Gatsby believed you could. But what's Nick doing? He's saying you can go back in the past, isn't he? The houses are melting. And he's saying, look, I'm looking at like the Dutch sailors who first arrived in New York. And they've seen this beautiful virgin continent. This is some of the most beautiful writing that I think is in 20th century fiction. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Nick is an idealist, isn't he? He's an American dreamer as well, just like Gatsby. And he takes the story of Gatsby and Daisy and he turns it into this American belief, this what they call infernal hope. It can actually be incredibly damaging. But here's the thing. The Dutch sailors weren't religious people, and they didn't go there to idolize the country and love it. They went there to kill, to rape, and to steal. They were merchants from Holland, and their goal in the United States was to enrich themselves. So even here, Nick's version of history, arguably, and that's a word I encourage you to use in your essays always, arguably, it may be the case. One way of reading it would be that Nick has idolized these Dutch explorers who were there as mercenary people for profit and for money. So this is going to conclude my first one. So the frontier looms large in the background of Gatsby, even though it doesn't occupy many sentences. The young, energetic Gatsby connects to the picaresque figure of Huckleberry Finn, who we think is one of the archetypes of American fiction. J. Gatsby is birthed in the vast landscape of Lake Superior. That's where he grows and is birthed, isn't he? In the new version of himself. And it comes because of this connection to Dan Cody. Dan Cody always remains his surrogate father, and in his plain Spartan bedroom, he only has one picture up. Not of his real father, but of Dan Cody, the father that he would have wanted. Gatsby is a shocking snob, isn't he? He stays in touch with his father, but clearly it's not the father that he wanted. And Wilson finally reveals that the promise of the West, of the frontier, is dead, and that the America that we see is America that is going to sicken and to eventually kill people like Wilson. That concludes the first section.